3 helpless puppies were tied to shooting targets on a frozen golf course, trembling as laughter echoed around them. For the powerful, it was entertainment. For the innocent, it was terror hidden behind money, silence, and influence. Then a retired Navy SEAL heard their cries and faced a choice God places before us all: walk away or step into the darkness. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from and subscribe for more stories of faith, courage, and the miracles God hides in the darkest places. Winter presses down on Bozeman, Montana, quiet streets, frozen breath, and a cold that sharpens memory. Snow falls without urgency, as if the city itself is holding something back. Ethan Walker had learned to live inside that quiet. It wasn't peace. He knew the difference. Peace had warmth in it. This was closer to a ceasefire, a careful arrangement between a man and the memories that refused to leave. The kind of arrangement you make when you understand that silence can be safer than answers. His cabin sat just beyond the last dependable streetlight, where the city thinned into trees and open land. Modest, functional, enough. Ethan liked things that worked without asking for attention. He had once lived in places where attention got people killed. The kettle hissed softly on the stove. Ethan didn't rush it. He stood with his hands braced on the counter, shoulders slightly hunched, as if the weight of the day had not yet decided whether to leave him alone. 46 wasn't old, but it was old enough to know which thoughts came back when the house went quiet. He had been a Navy SEAL. The title still followed him around like a shadow he didn't acknowledge. People imagined noise when they heard it, gunfire, explosions, heroics. Ethan remembered something else entirely: waiting, listening. The long, grinding seconds where everything depended on what you did not do. He had survived that life. That was the word people used: survived. What they didn't ask was what survival required afterward. The kettle clicked off. Ethan poured the water slowly, watching steam rise and vanish. He didn't think about the war, not directly. He thought about smaller things. The way his hands sometimes trembled when he was too tired, the way he measured exits in any room without meaning to, the way winter nights felt longer than they should. Outside, the wind shifted. Then came the sound. At first, Ethan thought it was just the wind slipping through the trees, forcing itself into shapes that sounded like voices. Montana winters did that. They played tricks. But this sound didn't fade. It fractured, sharp, high, and wrong. Another sound followed, then another. 3. Ethan froze with the mug halfway to his mouth. His body reacted before his mind allowed a name for it. Muscles tightened, breath stilled. His heart didn't race. It slowed, heavy and deliberate, as if it had recognized something old and unwelcome. The sounds were faint, carried and broken by distance, small, desperate, not human. Ethan set the mug down carefully, as though sudden movement might shatter something more fragile than porcelain. He stood there, listening, counting the seconds between each cry the way he once counted time between explosions. His first instinct was denial. Not your problem. People lived on large private properties out here, ranch land, wealthy developments tucked into the hills. What happened behind those fences was not an invitation. Ethan had learned that stepping into other people's darkness often came with consequences no one warned you about. He told himself that. He also told himself something else. That sound was not normal. It wasn't an animal calling into the night. It was panic, untrained, unfiltered panic, the kind that came from not understanding why pain had arrived or why no one was stopping it. Ethan closed his eyes. For a moment he was somewhere else, a different cold, different ground beneath his knees, a radio crackling with half words, someone breathing too fast beside him, trying not to cry out. He had promised himself he wouldn't chase ghosts anymore, but this wasn't a ghost. He walked to the door and rested his hand against the frame. The wood felt solid, familiar, safe. Everything inside this cabin was safe because he had made it so, because he had learned over time how to control the world down to the smallest circle. Outside that circle, things went wrong. The sounds came again, thinner now, as if whatever was making them was running out of breath. Ethan felt the old argument rise up inside him, sharp and methodical. You're done with that life. You don't know what this is. You can't fix everything. All of it was true. So was the other truth, quieter but heavier. You know exactly what this is. Ethan grabbed his coat. He didn't rush. Rushing led to mistakes. He pulled on boots, a hat, gloves, movements automatic, almost impersonal. When he opened the door, the cold cut into him with immediate precision, clearing his head the way pain sometimes did. Snow swallowed his footsteps as he moved away from the cabin. The sky was low and pale, the stars dimmed by clouds. Somewhere in the distance, lights glowed. Too clean, too deliberate. Not farm lights, not homes like his. He stopped again, listening. There it was. Closer now. 3 voices. Uneven. One higher than the others, breaking more often. The sound scraped against something deep in his chest, something he had built walls around for years. Ethan exhaled slowly, fog blooming in front of him. He thought about turning back, about closing the door and letting the world remain exactly as it had been an hour ago. No new variables, no new scars. He thought about how easy that would be. Then he remembered something an old instructor had said once, years ago, during a night exercise that had gone sideways. The hardest thing isn't pulling the trigger, the man had said. It's deciding not to walk away. Ethan adjusted his gloves and started walking toward the sound. He didn't know yet where it would lead. He didn't know who owned the land ahead or what kind of power lived there. He didn't know how much this choice would cost him. What he knew, what he could not unknow, was that whatever was crying out there had no choice at all. And for better or worse, Ethan Walker had never been very good at pretending he didn't hear things. The wind carried the sound again, and this time he didn't flinch. He walked on into the winter, leaving behind the fragile safety of his silence. The private golf course lay under artificial lights, green against winter's white, manicured into defiance. Snow was pushed aside, silence replaced by muted laughter, clinking glasses, and the dull certainty that money could bend even the season to its will. Ethan Walker slowed his steps at the edge of the course, not because of fear, but because his instincts told him to read the terrain before entering it. The cries were clearer here, no longer distorted by distance or wind. They were coming from inside the fenced property, near the far end of the driving range, where darkness pooled just beyond the reach of the floodlights. He felt the familiar tightening in his chest, the one that came when his mind recognized a situation his life had trained him for, but his conscience had hoped never to meet again. This place was wrong in a way that went beyond legality. It wasn't just private land. It was private cruelty, practiced openly, confidently, as if no one would ever dare to call it by its name. He stepped through an open service gate, boots crunching softly on packed snow, and immediately registered the details that mattered. The spacing of people, the casual way they stood, the absence of urgency. This was not chaos. This was a ritual. A small group of men stood near the tea area, dressed for leisure, drinks in hand, their posture loose with entitlement. At the center of their attention was Richard Coleman, a name Ethan would not yet know, but would soon carry like a stone in his pocket. Richard held a modified golf launcher, not a standard club, and his voice carried easily across the cold air, confident, amused. Ethan did not hear the words clearly, but he didn't need to. He recognized the tone. He had heard it before in other places, from other men who believed that power meant permission. Then Ethan saw them. 3 puppies, bound to small practice targets, sat at staggered distances, their bodies trembling not just from the cold, but from a confusion too large for them to understand. They did not struggle much anymore. Whatever panic had burned through them earlier had dulled into something smaller and more desperate. Ethan felt something inside him shift, not violently but decisively, like a door closing behind him. He had told himself he would assess, observe, choose the least damaging option. That was the lie he always told at the beginning. The truth was simpler and harder. There were moments when assessment ended the instant you understood what was happening. The men laughed when Richard fired the first shot. It struck the snow just short of one of the targets, close enough to make the puppy flinch and cry out. The sound cut through Ethan with surgical precision. His mind did not race. It narrowed. Time compressed into a familiar shape, one he had lived inside for years. He noted the distances, the angles, the lack of immediate security. He also noted the faces, not to remember them, but to accept that they were choosing this. That mattered. Ethan stepped forward then, his presence registering only at the last second, when Richard was already lining up another shot. Someone turned, startled, surprise flickering across a face unused to interruption. Ethan did not announce himself. He moved with the economy of someone who knew exactly how much force was required, and no more. His shoulder drove into Richard's center of mass, sending the older man sprawling backward onto the turf, the launcher skidding across the ground. The laughter died instantly, replaced by a stunned silence that felt fragile, easily broken. Ethan stood between the men and the targets, his breath steady, his hands relaxed at his sides. He felt the old calm settle over him, the one that always arrived when a line had been crossed and there was no longer any need to debate it. Someone shouted, another swore, but no one moved right away. They were recalculating, trying to understand how the rules had changed without their permission. Richard scrambled to his feet, anger flashing across his face, the shock already hardening into outrage. He started to speak, to reclaim control with words, but Ethan cut him off, his voice low and even, carrying just enough weight to make people listen. He said the police would be called. He said the animals would be taken for treatment. He said this would not be negotiated. The certainty in his tone unsettled them more than any threat could have. A woman stepped forward from the edge of the range, an older groundskeeper named Linda Harris, her hands shaking despite her effort to keep them still. She said quietly that this was not the first time. The words landed heavier than a shout. Ethan moved quickly then, untying the puppies, wrapping them inside his coat, feeling their small bodies press against him, not in trust yet, but in instinctive need. He turned and walked away before the men could decide who they wanted to be next. No one stopped him. The silence followed him all the way back to the gate, thick with something new, something uneasy. As Ethan reached the edge of the property, he felt it settle in his bones, the knowledge he had earned the hard way years ago. Moments like this never ended where you thought they would. Behind him, the lights of the golf course burned on, indifferent, and ahead of him the winter waited, patient, already preparing the cost of what he had just done. Night tightened its grip on Bozeman as snow fell harder, muffling sound and softening edges, while the road away from the golf course stretched dark and empty, offering no promise of safety, only distance. Ethan Walker drove with both hands steady on the wheel, his breathing measured, his eyes fixed on the narrow tunnel carved by the headlights. The puppies were pressed against him inside his coat, their small movements uneven and uncertain, each tremor registering like a quiet accusation. He did not look down at them, not yet. He had learned long ago that looking too closely at the cost of a decision before it was finished could make your hands hesitate. Hesitation was dangerous. He focused instead on the rhythm of the road, on the way the tires cut through slush, on the simple mechanical truth that forward motion was still possible. His mind replayed the scene on the golf course with an unwanted clarity. The laughter, the casual stance of men who had never been told no, the way silence had fallen when he stepped between cruelty and its target. He recognized the pattern now, and the recognition carried no satisfaction. It carried weight. Ethan knew that what he had interrupted was not an isolated act, but a habit, protected by money and reinforced by shared indifference. Habits fought back when challenged. He had challenged one. The veterinary clinic sat at the edge of town, its lights bright and unforgiving against the snow. Ethan parked and sat for a moment, one hand still on the steering wheel, the other holding his coat closed. His pulse was calm, but beneath that calm was the familiar awareness that the hardest part of an operation often came after the initial contact, when adrenaline faded and consequences arrived. Inside, the clinic smelled of disinfectant and fatigue. A veterinarian named Dr. Karen Liu met him at the door, her questions efficient, her attention already shifting to what needed to be done rather than why. Ethan answered briefly, sticking to facts, omitting motives. He had learned that explanations invited debate, and debate wasted time. He handed the puppies over without ceremony, watching as they were carried away, their sounds softening, but not disappearing. The emptiness in his arms felt heavier than their weight had. He sat in a plastic chair under fluorescent lights, his reflection faint in the window. A man paused between decisions. Memories crept in where they always did in moments like this, uninvited but insistent. Another waiting room years ago, another kind of injury, another official asking questions that had nothing to do with what mattered. He pushed the memories aside. This was different, he told himself, though he did not fully believe it. Dr. Liu returned after some time, her expression neutral, but not unkind. The puppies would live. There would be recovery, care, documentation. Documentation mattered. Ethan nodded, absorbing the information like a checklist, already thinking several steps ahead. He paid what he could, leaving more than he could afford without comment. Money was replaceable. Silence was not. When he stepped back outside, the cold hit him harder than before, the snow sharper, more insistent. His phone vibrated once in his pocket, then again. Unknown number. He let it ring out. He knew that call would come eventually. He had known it the moment he stepped onto the golf course. Back at the cabin, Ethan moved through the familiar space with deliberate slowness, as if cataloging it for the last time. He removed his coat, set his boots by the door, washed his hands longer than necessary. The quiet returned, but it had changed. It was no longer a ceasefire. It was a pause before response. He sat at the table and allowed himself briefly to feel the weight of what he had done. Not pride, not fear, responsibility. He thought about Linda Harris, the way her voice had shaken when she spoke, the relief that had flickered across her face afterward. He thought about the men who had laughed and how quickly that laughter had died. He thought about how power reacted when it was interrupted. Near dawn, the call came again, this time from a local number. Ethan answered. The voice on the other end was polite, professional, empty of urgency. A request to come in and answer some questions. A disturbance had been reported. Ethan agreed without argument. When the line went dead, he sat for a long moment, watching the sky lighten through the window. He did not feel surprised. He felt prepared. As he stood to get dressed, he understood something with a clarity that settled deep and firm. The night on the golf course had not been the beginning of this story. It had been the line that separated before from after. Whatever came next would test not his strength, but his willingness to stand still while others tried to move the truth out from under his feet. Morning settles over Bozeman under a pale winter sky. The police station, a low concrete building, rimmed with ice, its windows glowing softly as if warmth and fairness still lived easily inside institutions. Ethan Walker arrived early, not because he was eager, but because arriving late felt like conceding ground he did not intend to give up. He stepped into the station with the same measured awareness he brought everywhere now, registering the sound of boots on tile, the smell of old coffee, the way people looked past him with practiced neutrality. This place was designed to calm, to suggest order and process, and Ethan understood the purpose of that design. He also understood how easily calm could be used to smother truth. He gave his name at the front desk and waited without pacing, hands folded loosely, posture relaxed enough to appear cooperative, but not submissive. The waiting did its work anyway. It pulled at him, tugging loose memories he preferred to keep sealed. Waiting rooms were dangerous that way. They encouraged reflection, and reflection often invited doubt. When he was called back, the officers were exactly what he expected: clean uniforms, polite voices, expressions that gave nothing away. One of them, Officer Mark Reynolds, did most of the talking, his tone courteous, almost apologetic, as if this were an inconvenience for everyone involved. They asked Ethan to recount what happened at the golf course. He did so simply, describing the targets, the bound puppies, the weapon, the shots fired. He kept emotion out of it. Emotion gave people permission to question motives instead of facts. The other officer, a woman named Deputy Carla Monroe, listened quietly, fingers resting on a tablet, eyes occasionally lifting to study Ethan's face, not for guilt, but for inconsistency. Ethan had learned long ago that consistency was a form of armor. When he finished, there was a pause, the kind that suggested a transition from listening to judging. Officer Reynolds nodded and said they had reviewed the available security footage from the property. Ethan felt the smallest tightening in his jaw, not surprise, but recognition. The footage played on a screen across the room, grainy and distant. It showed the green underlights, the men gathered, Ethan stepping forward, the collision. It did not show the targets, it did not show the puppies, it did not show the weapon being fired. The absence was so complete it felt intentional, like a sentence with all the nouns removed. Ethan watched without interruption, his expression unchanged, though inside something cold and familiar settled into place. When the video ended, Reynolds explained that the property owner had filed a complaint for trespassing and assault. The puppies, according to the report, were not present. The activity was described as recreational practice with approved equipment. Ethan stated calmly that the footage was incomplete. He said that evidence had been removed. He said there were witnesses. Reynolds sighed softly, the sound of a man who had heard similar claims before and already decided how much effort they deserved. Deputy Monroe asked if Ethan had taken any photos or recordings himself. He answered honestly that he had not. Honesty, he knew, was a discipline, not a virtue. It often cost more than lies. They told him that no one present corroborated his account. No one. Ethan thought of Linda Harris, of the fear in her eyes, of how quickly fear learned to dress itself as loyalty when consequences appeared. He did not blame her. Blame was a luxury. Reynolds explained that without evidence, the case would proceed based on the complaint alone. Ethan was not being charged at this time, but he was advised to stay away from the property and to return any animals he had taken should ownership be disputed. The phrasing was careful, bureaucratic, designed to sound reasonable. Ethan agreed to the conditions with a nod. Agreement, he understood, was not the same as acceptance. He was released an hour later, stepping back into the cold with a clarity that surprised him. The city looked the same as it had that morning, but he did not. His phone buzzed before he reached his truck. A message from his employer informed him that his position was terminated pending investigation, effective immediately. No explanation, just a statement about reputational risk. Ethan deleted the message without rereading it. By the time he reached home, another envelope waited on the table, slipped through the mail slot. A notice from his landlord citing a clause about disturbances and liability, giving him 30 days to vacate. Ethan sat down slowly, the weight of it all pressing in at once, not crushing, but compressing, forcing everything closer together. This was the pattern revealing itself now, the second act he had anticipated, but hoped might be delayed. The system did not rush. It tightened gradually, efficiently, until movement became expensive. Ethan stared at the wall, letting the implications line up in his mind like pieces on a board. He felt no panic. Panic required uncertainty. This was certainty taking shape. By evening, the call he had been expecting finally came. A lawyer representing Richard Coleman spoke smoothly, suggesting resolution, mentioning misunderstandings, implying consequences. Ethan listened without interrupting, his thoughts already elsewhere. When the call ended, he did not feel defeated. He felt instructed. He understood now what kind of fight this was going to be, and more importantly, what kind it was not. It would not be loud, it would not be fast, and it would not be won by righteous anger. As night fell again over Bozeman, Ethan stood by the window and watched the snow erase tracks in the street below. Evidence disappeared easily when no one was looking. He would not make that mistake again. Evening returns with heavier snow. Bozeman dimmed to amber streetlights and long shadows, while Ethan's cabin feels smaller, as if the walls have leaned in to listen. Ethan Walker sits at the table with the day's consequences spread before him, papers aligned not out of hope but habit, the way he once laid out gear before missions that had no margin for error. He reads everything once, then again, not searching for mercy but for pattern. The termination notice uses neutral language, careful to avoid accusation, confident that silence will do the rest. The eviction letter is polite, almost apologetic, invoking clauses and liability as if the words themselves were the ones pushing him out. Ethan recognizes the tone immediately. It is the voice of institutions protecting themselves by removing variables. He has become a variable. The phone rests face down beside the papers, its weight felt even when it does not vibrate, because he knows who will call next and why. He breathes slowly, counting the seconds the way he used to when waiting for a door to open on the other side of a wall, letting the first wave of anger pass without giving it permission to decide anything. Anger is easy. Anger is loud. Anger burns bright and leaves nothing useful behind. He does not need it. He needs clarity. He thinks about the golf course again, not the moment of impact, but the moments after, the way the men recalculated, the way laughter turned to quiet as if someone had turned down a dial. He thinks about Linda Harris and the fraction of a second it took her to speak, the relief that followed, and the fear that must have replaced it once she went home. He understands fear intimately. Fear teaches people to edit themselves. Fear is how habits survive. The phone buzzes at last. Ethan answers without greeting. The man on the other end introduces himself as an attorney representing Richard Coleman, his voice smooth, controlled, practiced in rooms where outcomes are discussed as if they were weather. He speaks of misunderstandings, of private property, of reputational harm. He suggests a path forward that involves cooperation, discretion, and the return of what he calls assets. Ethan listens without interrupting, noting not just what is said, but what is avoided. There is no mention of animals, no acknowledgement of harm, no curiosity about the truth. Only closure, only containment. When the lawyer finishes, Ethan says he needs time. The lawyer agrees readily because time, in this context, is leverage. After the call ends, the cabin feels quieter than before, the silence now sharpened into something deliberate. Ethan stands and moves through the space, touching familiar objects as if taking inventory, not because he expects to leave immediately, but because knowing what can be taken away changes how you hold on to things. He pours water into the sink and watches it spiral down the drain, thinking about evidence and how easily it disappears when no one is watching. The clinic comes to mind, the veterinarian's efficient calm, the way documentation had been mentioned as an afterthought that mattered more than it seemed. Documentation matters. He thinks about cameras, about angles, about who controls the story when no one else is recording. The thought settles, not fully formed yet, but heavy enough to pull other ideas into its orbit. Ethan sits again and closes his eyes, allowing himself one brief look backward. Not to the war, not to the moments people imagine when they hear what he used to be, but to a smaller, quieter failure years ago when he had trusted that a report would be enough, that someone else would follow through, that the system would do what it claimed to do. It had not. The cost of that trust had been measured in time and regret. He opens his eyes and looks at the papers again, at the neat sentences designed to end conversations. He folds them carefully and places them in a drawer, not to hide them, but to mark them as something unfinished. Outside, the snow continues, erasing tracks with patient indifference. Ethan pulls on his coat and steps out onto the porch, letting the cold bite into him until his thoughts sharpen. He does not feel cornered. He feels instructed. The path offered to him is silence in exchange for relief, compliance in exchange for the illusion of safety. It is a familiar offer, one he has seen extended to others who took it because they needed to believe the pain would stop if they did. He knows better. Pain does not stop. It relocates. Ethan decides then what kind of fight this will be, not in tactics yet, but in principle. He will not argue with power on its terms. He will not shout into rooms designed to absorb sound. If the truth is going to matter, it will have to be seen, not explained. The realization does not arrive with triumph. It arrives with a quiet acceptance of cost. He understands that choosing this path means losing things he has already lost on paper and risking things he still has. He understands that the next move will narrow his options further. He also understands that walking away would narrow something else, something he has spent years trying to keep intact. As he turns back inside, the phone buzzes again, a short message from an unknown number requesting confirmation of a meeting time. Ethan does not respond immediately. He sets the phone down and looks at the blank wall above the table, already imagining where a small, unobtrusive lens might sit, how it might see without being seen. The thought steadies him. Outside, a gust of wind sends snow swirling across the porch, briefly revealing footprints before covering them again. Ethan watches through the window and allows himself a thin, almost imperceptible smile, because he knows something the men on the golf course do not. Habits depend on darkness, and darkness depends on no one turning on the light. Late afternoon sinks into a colorless winter dusk as Bozeman stiffens under cold light, the private golf course re-emerging beyond its gates, orderly and quiet, as if nothing wrong had ever learned to breathe there. Ethan Walker parks farther away this time, choosing distance over convenience, and sits with the engine off, letting the silence settle around him like a deliberate choice. He feels different from the man who drove away days ago with trembling lives pressed against his chest. Not braver, not calmer, simply clearer. Clarity is not comfort, it is alignment, and alignment carries its own weight. He checks the phone once not to read messages, but to confirm the small icon he has memorized, the one that tells him a lens is awake, that something unseen is now paying attention. The plan is simple enough to survive stress. Simple plans last. He steps out into the cold and walks toward the course with the same measured pace he once used, crossing exposed ground, neither hurried nor hesitant, allowing his presence to register when it must, and not before. The gate opens without challenge. No one expects resistance from someone who agreed to terms, who asked for time, who did not shout or threaten. Compliance breeds assumptions, and assumptions create blind spots. Inside the property, the lights are fewer than before, focused on the range where a small gathering has reassembled, quieter, tighter, as if the night itself has learned discretion. Ethan notes the faces again, not with anger, but with a detached awareness that these people believe the moment has passed. They believe consequences are temporary things that belong to other people. He moves closer, staying at the edge of attention, letting the familiar pull of adrenaline wash through him without taking control. The puppies are there again, not the same configuration, but the same reality, bound and confused, their distress no longer sharp, but dulled into a low, persistent signal that refuses to stop. Ethan feels it like pressure behind his eyes. He does not rush to them, not yet. He has learned that rescue without exposure only resets the pattern. Richard Coleman stands near the equipment, speaking in a voice pitched for reassurance rather than amusement this time. There is tension beneath his words, a need to reassert control not just over the situation but over himself. Ethan recognizes that need too. He has felt it in other men, in other rooms, just before things broke. The lawyer's words echo faintly in his mind about misunderstandings and closure, and he understands now how closure is manufactured. You repeat the act until it feels normal again. You prove to yourself that nothing has changed. Ethan steps forward then, not fast, not loud, just enough to be seen. Richard turns, surprise flashing briefly before calculation replaces it. There is a moment of stillness, the kind that feels like the space between thunder and rain. Ethan raises his phone slightly, not to threaten, not to announce, but to position. He says one word, calm and clear, a word that carries weight because it names what is happening instead of reacting to it. Stop. Richard laughs, the sound brittle, edged with irritation rather than humor. He says Ethan is trespassing again, that this has already been handled, that there is an agreement. Ethan does not argue. He turns the phone so the lens can see the targets, the bindings, the hands that adjust them. He does not narrate. Narration invites debate. He lets the image speak. For a second, nothing changes. Then someone shifts uncomfortably. A man at the edge of the group looks away. The silence thickens, charged now with awareness. Ethan feels the moment stretch, fragile and dangerous, and he knows this is where people either step back or double down. Richard doubles down. He lifts the device again, not aiming yet, just holding it with intent, and begins to speak about property and discipline, about boundaries and consequences, about how order is maintained when people understand their place. The words spill out more freely than he intends, carried by the confidence of a man who believes the room belongs to him. Ethan remains still, his body an anchor, his attention split between the threat in front of him and the quiet knowledge that somewhere beyond this fence, the world is now watching. He does not feel righteous. He feels precise. A voice breaks the tension, thin but steady. Linda Harris steps forward from the shadows, her hands clenched at her sides. She says she saw it before. She says she sees it now. The admission costs her visibly, but once spoken, it cannot be retrieved. Another worker nods, then another. The sound of agreement is soft, uneven, but it exists, and that is enough. Richard's posture changes, tightening, his authority suddenly forced to account for witnesses. Ethan senses the shift and moves, placing himself fully between the device and the animals, his stance open, unthreatening, immovable. He feels the cold through his boots, the ache in his knees, the old familiarity of standing ground without advancing. Sirens cut through the air, distant at first, then unmistakable. Richard's confidence falters, recalculating again, this time too late. He lowers the device, not out of mercy, but out of instinct. The police arrive in a wash of light and sound that fractures the carefully controlled scene. Commands are issued. Hands are raised. Ethan steps back, making space without retreating, careful to keep the lens unobstructed until it no longer needs him to. He feels a strange calm as the bindings are cut and the puppies are lifted free, their distress shifting into something less sharp, less alone. He does not reach for them this time. He watches, ensuring the moment exists beyond him. As officers take statements and separate people into small, manageable groups, Ethan stands to the side, cold settling into his bones, exhaustion pressing in now that the tension has broken. He knows this is not an ending. It is a pivot. Systems do not collapse in one night, and men like Richard do not vanish quietly. But something irreversible has occurred. The darkness has been interrupted. As an officer approaches him with measured professionalism, Ethan pockets his phone, the small icon finally dimming. He meets the officer's eyes without defiance, without apology. He has nothing left to explain. The truth is already moving, no longer dependent on his voice alone. Snow begins to fall again, light and persistent, dusting the scene with a deceptive softness. Ethan watches it settle and understands that the next chapter will not be about confrontation, but about endurance, about holding a line while others decide what to do with what they have seen. And for the first time since the night he heard the cries, he allows himself a single, steady breath, knowing that the cost he accepted has finally begun to mean something beyond himself. Winter loosens its hold over Bozeman, the snow thinning to pale residue along streets and fields, while the golf course sits quiet under daylight, stripped of spectacle, and left with the plain geometry of consequence. Ethan Walker remains near the perimeter as the scene resolves, not because he is uncertain, but because distance has become his way of understanding what remains after noise leaves. The officers move with methodical calm, documenting, separating, speaking in clipped phrases that promise process rather than relief. Ethan answers questions when asked, briefly and accurately, the way he learned to do when truth needed to travel without decoration. He watches the puppies carried to safety again, their distress easing not into trust yet, but into something more durable, the knowledge that the pain has paused and that someone stayed long enough to see it through. He does not reach out this time. He has learned that care can exist without possession. A detective introduces herself as Maria Alvarez, a name offered without ceremony, her questions steady, her attention directed toward facts rather than performance. She mentions that the live stream preserved more than images, that statements were captured in real time, that witnesses have already contacted the department. Ethan nods, neither surprised nor relieved. He understands that momentum is not mercy, but it can be useful if you do not mistake it for an ending. As the crowd thins and the lights dim, Linda Harris stands nearby, her shoulders lighter than they were, as if saying the truth out loud has changed the way gravity treats her. She does not thank Ethan. Gratitude would suggest a debt. Instead, she tells him she will testify and means it. That is enough. By the time Ethan leaves the property, dawn has lifted fully, revealing a city that looks ordinary again, a dangerous illusion he recognizes for what it is. At home, he sleeps without dreams, the kind of sleep earned by exhaustion rather than peace. When he wakes, the consequences continue to arrive, but their shape has changed. The charges evaporate quietly, not with apology, but with the dry language of insufficiency and evidence reviewed. His employer does not call back, but a message arrives from a local logistics firm offering temporary work, no questions asked. He accepts it without pride. Work he knows is not redemption, but it keeps the days aligned. Donations begin to appear as well, small at first, then larger, accompanied by notes that say little beyond acknowledgement. Ethan does not read them all. He forwards what he can to the clinic and asks Dr. Karen Lou To set aside funds for ongoing care and documentation, because continuity matters more than gestures. The lawyer's voice returns once, sharper now, less certain, suggesting settlement and discretion. Ethan declines without argument. There is nothing left to settle. The landlord rescinds the eviction with a brief email citing changed circumstances. Ethan does not reply. He stays anyway, not out of victory, but because leaving would grant the place a significance it does not deserve. Weeks pass, the season shifting almost imperceptibly, and the story moves through channels Ethan does not control. Reports surface, then follow-ups. The golf course closes for inspection. Richard Coleman appears once more, briefly, in a local headline that uses careful phrasing and avoids moral language. Ethan does not clip it. He does not keep souvenirs of endings. What he keeps instead is a routine that has widened just enough to include other people. On Saturdays, he visits the clinic to help with transport and paperwork, discovering that the work he does best now is the kind that stays invisible. The puppies recover, their inner weather settling into something steadier, their responses no longer dominated by fear, but by cautious engagement, a small courage that grows with consistency. Ethan watches from a respectful distance, understanding that survival is not the same as flourishing, and that both require time. One afternoon, Detective Alvarez stops by the clinic to update him, not because it is required, but because she knows what it costs to stand alone at the beginning of a story and wait for others to catch up. She tells him the case will proceed, that testimony will matter, that systems move slowly, but not always backward. Ethan listens and thanks her without optimism. Optimism is a luxury he has never trusted. What he trusts instead is repetition, the unglamorous discipline of showing up again and again until the extraordinary loses its cover. As spring approaches, Bozeman changes its tone, the cold receding, the light lingering longer in the evenings. Ethan takes longer walks, not to escape his thoughts, but to let them settle into a shape that no longer cuts. He thinks about the night he heard the cries and understands that the sound did not pull him forward because it was loud, but because it was specific. Suffering becomes easier to ignore when it blends into general noise. It becomes harder when it has a voice. On a quiet morning, he receives a short message from Linda Harris saying simply that she testified and that it felt like stepping out from behind glass. Ethan deletes the message after reading it once, not out of indifference, but because the meaning has already done its work. The story concludes not with celebration, but with redistribution. Attention moves on. Resources reallocate. A small building on the edge of town becomes a hub for coordination between clinics, volunteers, and transport. Not an institution, just a place where leashes hang neatly and schedules are posted clearly. Ethan does not put his name on anything. Names attract expectations, and expectations distort purpose. He stands at the edge of the space sometimes, watching people move with a quiet efficiency that suggests trust has been rebuilt one action at a time. When asked why he intervened, he answers once and then stops answering, because the explanation does not improve with repetition. He says that silence is a choice and that he did not choose it. That is all. On the last cold evening before the snow fully releases its grip, Ethan locks up and steps outside, breathing air that no longer hurts. He looks back once, not at the building, but at the ordinary street beyond it, where life continues without ceremony. He understands now that endings are not declarations. They are maintenance. They are the decision to keep a door from closing again. Ethan turns and walks home, carrying nothing with him except the steady knowledge that when the light was turned on, it stayed on long enough to matter, and that this, finally, is what it means to finish something. Sometimes miracles do not arrive with thunder or fire from the sky. Sometimes they come quietly, through an ordinary person who refuses to look away when suffering asks to be seen. In moments like these, it is not strength that changes the world, but obedience to a small, insistent voice placed in the heart by God. Every day we are given choices that seem insignificant, whether to stay silent, whether to walk past pain, whether to tell ourselves it is not our responsibility. Yet Scripture reminds us that light shines brightest in darkness, and that God often works through willing hands, not perfect ones. In our daily lives, we may never face dramatic trials, but we face moments where kindness costs us comfort, where truth requires courage, and where love asks for action. If this story moved you, let it be a reminder that even the smallest step toward compassion can become a miracle in someone else's life. Please share this story so its light can reach others. Leave a comment with your thoughts or prayer requests, and subscribe to the channel so more stories of hope can continue to travel. May God bless you, protect your loved ones, and strengthen your heart whenever you are called to stand for what is right.